At the beginning of Jesus' ministry, he went into the desert for 40 days. It was a preparation of his own head and his own heart, his very being, for all of the difficulties that would lie ahead. And he wanted to be able to focus, wanted to think clearly and without distraction. This place over those 40 days was one where he could remember truly how small he was. If you've ever been to the Holy Land, or hey, if you've ever been to any kind of deserted place, even in our own country, you can see that in that kind of arid land and place where there's no light pollution, very little trees to get in your way, this space was one where he could see the stars and be enveloped by this blanket of the cosmos and its beauty. Again, being reminded of the small nature of who he was in connection to all that is, all that the Father made from the beginning. In the wilderness, the real wilderness, and then the proverbial wildernesses that we continue to experience all the time, these are times when we often might feel most alone, most dry in our spirit, most desperate. These are the places where we too are most vulnerable and may be able to be swayed by anything that would pique our interest. This is when the tempter always comes. And maybe you can give witness to that. But he saw into what he thought were Jesus's greatest desires, saw seemingly into his human soul of what he might want, and used all of these as a hook. He says, turn your attention here, give your heart here, and you'll have everything you could ever want. This moment in Jesus' life mirrors one of the greatest struggles of human beings that has been in existence again and again over time. And so if we fast forward not to today's time, but about 1,500 years roughly, you might remember from your social studies class, dusting off your brain a few years back or a few more years back, learning something about what was called the Copernican Revolution. Anybody remember? Anybody that you're worshiping with in your living room right now? Do you remember what that is? You can show you're real smart if you tell them what that means at this moment. But for those of us, many of us probably, that maybe have to reach back a little too far for our memory's reckoning, this was the moment where we as human beings all across the world discovered, or some would say remembered once again, that there's this tension between the awareness of ourselves and the awareness of that which is beyond ourselves. This has been one of the greatest struggles in and around and through the course of time. And when Nicholas Copernicus found himself as a discoverer, if you will, he challenged the age-long views of the way that the universe worked. Again, people even in the time of the writing of the Bible in the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament, even they believed that the earth on which they were standing was the very center of all that is. And they learned from Nicholas Copernicus, even though he was kind of pushed aside. There's a whole story behind that I won't say today, but violently pushed aside in his voice and in his person, but yet still his discovery and the truth remained that the planet Earth is not of greater importance and not the center of the universe. And by extension, human beings are much smaller than we thought. We're a much smaller part of a much greater whole. It was the realization that we, our planet, indeed our solar system, even our galaxy, are quite common in the heavens, not exceptional. And that there are many other systems just like us. All of this that was a world-rocking, even soul-rocking kind of discovery. It was provided a sobering and yet unsettling view of who we are in our very existence. All of the reassurances that people found, the comfort that people found in the cosmology of the early and Middle Ages were gone. And a whole new view of the world, less secure, less privileged, came into being. So, case in point, our greatest fear was found to be true, that the whole universe doesn't revolve around us. And the important truth to remember then as it is today is one that we're going to really unpack in this continuation of our series of why we worship. Over the next several weeks, we're going to talk about a lot of different ways that worship is important. Again, last week talking about how God's call in the midst of worship allows us to push away all distractions so that we can truly enhance our lives. It is a source of conviction in a complex world. It is a source of healing in a time where we each and all need a balm for our wounds. It is essential to a life that is filled with purpose and meaning. But the major premise behind this whole series is that human beings are wired to worship something. It's just a question, truly, of what that something worship is centered upon. So I wonder about you today. If you really examine your life, again, there was this old saying that the unexamined life is not worth living, that philosophers said. If you really examine your life, if you took stock deep within, even right now as I'm speaking with you today, if you examine your life, what would you find at the very center of your universe? And I want you to go ahead and push away all of the normal and expected answers. Well, of course, my family is the center of my universe. My children are the center of my universe. All of those things are really good. Even my work is the center of my universe. But I want you to take one step deeper underneath those answers to what truly drives you. If your family is the center of your universe, is it perhaps maybe a drive toward having a legacy where you will not be forgotten? Again, one that has great intentions, meant for good for many people you love, but is also grounded, perhaps, in fear. Do you have a preoccupation in your work with success, maybe with making the money that will offer you the security that perhaps you don't quite feel right now, and it asks you to trade this value for some others that are also equally as important? I wonder if for you, when you wake up, it is not waking up thanking God for all that God has done that is at the center of your attention and in my attention, but perhaps we are actually worshiping the anxiety that keeps our minds alive and going, or the despair that allows us to become numb to all of the pain that is experienced around and within. I want you to go a layer deeper than the usual answers and ask yourself and even grapple with God, what is really happening with my worship and that which I focus all of my attention upon right now? Because the way that we spend our minutes and our weeks and our very months, as far as what we focus on, is truly how we spend our lives. And so for us, What captivates our attention is both important to realize and also complicated. So again, it is not as black and white of a thing to say, you feel this, oh, you shouldn't do this. I understand that. I live those complexities with you. But the truth that we want to dig into and remind ourselves of today is truly the whole universe does not revolve around us and our own fears or even our own interests. But you'd never, ever know it looking around. I've often wondered where this shift happened for us, where we have allowed these preoccupations to be the center of our heart and our very world and our energy. Maybe it was in the Garden of Eden. Maybe it was somewhere along the way. I have a sense that probably it was milestone after milestone that has been cumulative over time to bring us to our predicament in this moment. I know there was a moment in the early 1900s that is one that I think we can connect with today because it plays to what we still live even now. Did you know that there was a point in time where when you bought something and didn't like it, you and I were out of luck? I can't even imagine it, right? But in the early 20th century, retailers like Marshall Field, he's a name that you can remember, and some others surely started popularizing a marketing idea that what? Anybody remember? The customer is always right. So from that point on, if you didn't like the boots you bought, you could just send them back. And then restaurants began to follow suit as kind of a retail idea to generate more engagement, more commitment and loyalty from customers, that if you didn't like your meal, you can just send it on back, right? While this shift to a consumer-oriented culture has been great for retail sales, it is, without a doubt, a tremendous threat to each of us in our relationship with God and a healthy view of our worship of God. The point of worship, remember, is to orient our lives around God and to allow that orientation to change us from the inside out. But increasingly, we do bring that customer mentality with us to our worship, whether we're here in this sanctuary sitting on our couches, or even if there are other ways that you find yourself worshiping in your everyday living. So we leave worship wherever you find yourself. We leave or step out of or move out of a posture of worship, asking things like, did I get something out of it? Was I fed or filled? And sometimes we just come to the conclusion, that didn't feed me. It wasn't what I needed. Let me go to the next place, the next community, the next opportunity. I know we have nobody in our community at university here like that, but I again, don't mean to step on toes. I'm just speaking a reality that is human for us. I share it along with you. This is a natural reaction that we all have, and we look for things to enliven and inspire us and give us energy, but these expectations sound strikingly familiar to those that the tempter used to at least capture Jesus in his point of weakness. If you look at scripture that Reverend Carol read for us, Jesus encountered this evil one, this tempter, and was promised that the tempter would first create bread out of stones to relieve his unrelenting hunger. And that if Jesus, second, could leap from a pinnacle, a high point, and just allow himself to fly, then he could rely on the angels to break his fall. And then, third, if he would kneel before this tempter, this one in return, he would get all of the kingdoms of the world to bow and to worship him. Again, if we think about that question I asked earlier about you to take stock of those drivers of what we worship underneath the trappings and tasks and commitments of our lives, perhaps we might find ourselves in one of these three temptations too. This is a time where we, at least during Lent, think a lot about these temptations, but it's a consideration and a question that we have to hold in every time, especially as we are taking on new things and many families are stressed and pressed to the brink. These are the weak moments where we may lose ourselves as well. We all have times where we're hungry, when we doubt God's faithfulness or God's presence in our lives, and when we're tempted to reach for power or for that greener pasture to alleviate the pain of what is in this moment, thinking that somewhere over there it's going to be better in that relationship, it is going to be better. All of this continues to captivate us at times instead of living a life as a servant exactly where we are. In all of these cases, I find the old adage, wanting is better than having, to be true and wise and helpful. If you think of every movie or book over the years, really think about it. Anything from classics like Aesop's Fables to movies like Aladdin, the children's movie where genies come and give any master that rubs the lamp whatever he or she may dream or want. These movies and stories of granting every wish where characters represent us, they remind us that trading one thing to have their desire in another instance, that it didn't always quite work out for them. And so when you and I have done that, because I know we have, every single one of us can perhaps give testimony to one time in our lives where we made the trade, whatever that looked like for you and for me. How did it work out? I was reminded of this question that was lived in a dear friend. I'm going to call him Joe to protect the innocent. And this friend I made as a pastor in another church, and he and I started a ministry together along with many other people. He was a gifted man, a devoted father, and had a deep and good heart. He also just happened to be an addict. And over the course of time, it seemed like he was living really healthily. He was extremely effective and just a great member of the team until everything that was happening underneath the surface came to emerge to the fore by him admitting that he needed help. And so we sent him off to a facility, gave him the resources that he needed, but it was really he that did the courageous work of digging and deepening his awareness of what was happening within his own soul. Even in the midst of a rehab facility, he found himself in a sense leaning into the worship of God through doing the hard things of grappling with that which was binding him, those temptations that were captivating him and holding him back from his life. And when he came back out, he continued to follow daily in an addiction community where they were following the steps. As some of you hearing my voice may know these steps well, you can say them by heart. Steps like number 1, we admit that we are powerless over our addiction and our lives often become unmanageable. Step 2, make a decision to turn your will and your lives over to the care of God as you understand God. And there are many, many other steps from submitting yourself to the will of God, even when it's hard, to confessing those places where you have been wrong, to asking forgiveness from those that you love. Does this sound familiar at all? Now, Joe has a new relationship and has continued to be a doting and deeply loving father with his child, and is continuing to make an impact to untold many by sharing his story. Now, I don't always share these stories that seem to be buttoned up or tied up in a pretty little bow, but I say this, that every time I think of Joe and every time I see the courageous communities of addiction that meet around our church all the time, I often think, wow, these communities have the courage to do the work that we often don't. Either in our lack of engagement in worship, or even when we're in worship. When I'm in worship, you're in worship, we may find ourselves often, if not always, going through the motions rather than allowing the call of God to sink deeply into our bones and ask, what is the Spirit saying to this human heart? At its core, this is all what worship is for, and even more and most importantly, these communities are doing it together and not allowing themselves to hide alone with all that binds them. I wonder why it takes so many of us hitting rock bottom to actually take this kind of work seriously. Maybe it's also the church that needs to ask the same question of are we facilitating the kind of experience that will allow for this kind of interface with God and with ourselves to actually happen? Jesus was tempted the third time, and he said in that moment when he woke up and said, "Worship the Lord your God and serve God only." It is the teaching echoed throughout the Bible. Have no other gods before me. You alone are worthy of my praise. O Lord, seek first God's kingdom. And this is why regular and habitual worship is so important. It saves us from ourselves. It changes us. It creates a life oriented around and rooted in God's promises that are sure. I've had some wonderful conversations with folks in our congregation about so many different things related to past memories, but especially hopes for the future. And one of the questions that I continue to receive from multiple people is a question about our worship, a question of who we will be, what worship will look like. Will we do something new to refresh what we're about and maybe try to attract and reach new people? And I haven't said it out loud, but I often say in my spirit, because it's the conviction that I always have to hold in my own life before I would ask it of anyone else. It is this: to attract new people and to change lives through worship, we must first have the courage and the vulnerability to allow ourselves to be changed. Whatever becomes of us, University Church, we're going to have to be very clear that anything we do is to glorify God first and to make and create space for God to be made real and known in the lives of others outside of our current fellowship, on the edges of society in this new iteration of what God is calling us to do. In a post-pandemic time, whenever that will be, and we praise God and speak it into existence even now. This time has exacerbated and accelerated some of the questions that I've been asking in various churches and you have been asking in this place for years. Who are we to be? What is the Spirit saying to the church now? And we will most likely be prodded to do that which God has been asking, whispering, shouting, calling for us to do for a long time all along the way. And sometimes we have been attuned to it, and other times our ears have been deafened. We have to identify those that we would reach out to and seek God's guidance, not congregational preference, about how we would meet the needs that God alone will reveal to us. Worship is God-centered, with God as the audience and we as the ones that lovingly provide the offering with gratitude. And anything we say or give God really does revolve around three prayers. Anne Lamott said this in one of her books. Our worship really revolves around these prayers: help, thanks, and wow. Help, so that we can give up any perceived control that we've been holding on to as we enter into worship. Thanks to God for loving us and being with us in all things. And wow, because of all that God has done. And so today, as we close, I want to invite you to take stock of your own hearts. Confront those places in your life where you have made your own needs, your own perspectives, our own desires as an idol. As we continue to worship, I'd invite you, as I invite myself every day, to make room for a revolution in our lives once again, remembering that we are only one small, moving part of a much greater whole of the universe. The gravity of the sun, the very center, keeps all of us in orbit, and we stay in our orbit because there is no other force in the solar system powerful enough to stop us. Regular and habitual worship creates a life oriented around God. And it's when our lives are thus oriented that everything else falls into place. In the name of God, who was and is to come. Amen.